Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a virtual ProHort. Well, we do these in the fall. This year we decided to do one of our face-to-face presentations because we just to help people, seasonal employees, people that aren't able to attend the face-to-face, there's an opportunity for you to hear these presentations. And we'll have a recorded version of each of them if needed. So to begin with today, I'm going to turn it right over. Our first presentation is on pesticide communications with John Fetch.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kelly and Elizabeth and Emily. I appreciate that. We'll jump right in. This is kind of divided into 4 sections with hopefully smooth transitions among them. And I think Rock and I put this together with the commercial audiences combined, lots of the audiences, right? So we have school grounds people, we have cemeterians, we have lawn care people, all with different clients. And so try to make it generic. And if you don't understand, you can, I think we can type in the Q&A or the chat and try to get some of your questions answered that way. And so we'll just jump right into this. Again, the opening screen there just illustrates a lot of different settings and a lot of different questions about how we go about communicating these important messages. So here's just kind of a brief outline. We talk about the different classifications of products. The important thing is to talk about risk and benefit, but also to understand perception and reality. And we all look at things differently. We'll talk about the communication process itself, and then we'll finish up with some messaging techniques that you can use with your customers and clients. Embedded in with those 4 basic components, there are a variety of subtopics, and we'll get to all of those. But it is a central, pest management being a central component. Generally getting questions and customers, you can think of that as a negative thing because it interrupts your day, but you can also think it as a positive thing because it could lead to better relationships and maybe even more income from clients that aren't availing themselves of your full services. Also, you need to think about stakeholders being a wide variety, again, and community groups, end users, customers, vendors, a variety of things. The term risk, I think, is really crucial to this, and comparing risk and hazards, risk and benefits really helps. We'll dive in and do a deep dive on one particular example. Also just need to realize that a lot of people don't have the background that you do. Most of you, I'm sure, are certified pesticide applicators. Some are certified nursery professionals, certified arborists, have that background and understand these things a little bit better. We need to remember about perception and information sources. Very different than we started doing this in the 80s and 90s, where we get our information. The word safe, we'll talk about that word. It's kind of a tricky word to use. And then we'll go on to try to be successful. We look at things like this sign and a lot of different reactions you might have to that. In the way I perceive this, or the way I get a reaction from this, is at the top, I feel fairly good about that. Caution, okay, something I need to be careful about. And then as it moves downward, it gets a little bit more tricky. Pesticide spraying, okay, I'm very familiar with pesticides. And then the bottom message, proceed at your own risk. Ooh, that's a little bit, ooh, what does that mean? That's something dangerous? It really is an interesting sign with some mixed messages there. So it's good for awareness, and it's also good because it could mean different things to different people. So to dig into this a little bit, we're going to do a deep dive on the recent case with the product glyphosate. And at that time, it was labeled as the product Roundup. And so that's important to know as well. There are 2 agencies that were involved in the recent actions, the IARC, the International Agency Research on Cancer, and then the US EPA. Now, most of us are very familiar with the US EPA. But honestly, I was not that familiar with the IARC until about 6 months ago. But they're part of the World Health Organization. Then there's some actions that they took. The IARC looked at information and classified glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, or was at that time, and they classified it as probably carcinogenic to humans. The EPA, a different agency, looked at all the data and stated that glyphosate is not likely to be carcinogenic to humans. So there appears to be a bit of a conflict there. And then a whole bunch of other organizations, such as Health Canada, European Food Safety Authority, the National Institute of Health, issued similar conclusions as to the EPA. So you might be thinking, that's a disconnect. Why would that be? So we'll go through a bunch of these illustrations, and at the end, you'll see why those things happened. One of the things I want to say right up front is the products you see at your grocery store, your hardware store, box stores, garden centers, is another little bit of a disconnect. And so if you deal with homeowners or property owners, or even parks and grounds, if if there's a regular, advisory board, SID, HOA, they may not understand this, that consumer brand Roundup is a brand name of a product that you can buy over the counter versus an individual herbicide. So the Roundup is not necessarily glyphosate. It could be, but it could also be something that contains other herbicidal ingredients. And it's just good to have that recognition up front, whereas most people would understand that Roundup is something that kills grass and a variety of other plants and doesn't really discriminate, but it's not necessarily the same. That Roundup brand name has been sold. In fact, here's one, Roundup for Lawns, and you can get this at any box store. This is a very similar product to the tried and true product Trimec or Speed Zone, Power Zone. Roundup for Lawns. It contains the active ingredients to kill dandelions and plantain and clover. And it's not going to kill everything that it touches. So a very different type of product along those lines. A little bit more information on IARC. Again, it's part of the World Health Organizations, and its major goal is to identify causes of cancer. They have this group of different ways to do that, and to classify each active ingredient into either definitely carcinogenic, probably carcinogenic, possibly carcinogenic, who knows whether it's carcinogenic or unclassifiable, and then probably not carcinogenic. What's important to know is the IARC identifies cancer hazards, not a risk, not the probability of causing problems. So that's helpful to know. On the other hand, the US EPA drew its conclusions from actual data. Dietary, residential, non-occupational, aggregate, or occupational exposures, as well as an in-depth review of the glyphosate cancer database, including data from epidemiological, animal carcinogenicity, and genotoxicity studies. So they looked at real-world studies, and in their mind, they're always thinking about the risk formula. Risk equals toxicity times exposure, as opposed to the IARC, which simply looks at toxicity. So when the EPA looks at that, they have their labels that they oversee and they work on with the company that makes the different products. When those label directions are followed, their conclusions are the risk posed by glyphosate is sufficiently low enough to release it for use by homeowners and professionals. The EPA asks, can it cause cancer? As well as the balance part of that is what level of exposure is expected to get the answer to the question, is that exposure likely to cause cancer? So actually the IARC and the EPA conclusions don't conflict. They're just answering two different questions. So the EPA asked the questions as directed, does this product cause cancer? And the IARC asked the question, could it cause cancer ever, under any circumstances? So it's good to just know the background as to why those two things happen. Actually, the IARC decision and announcement is a good thing because it prompted over 800 studies of glyphosate by 18 worldwide regulatory agencies. Side note, none of which agreed with them. So that's just good to know that this raised, shone a little light on this possibility and involved a re-study of the data. So that's really good. Now, the IARC drew its conclusions from lab animal studies in which they were exposed to extremely high levels of glyphosate over their entire life and then examined for cancer. Now, the lab animals that are used are surrogates. They're not regular lab animals. They're like mice you would see in the field. They're genetic strains of mice and rats that are developed for cancer susceptibility. And you kind of want that. You want to have animals that, if there is any risk, that they're going to get cancer from it, and therefore some additional studies might be necessary. In this specific case, both testing groups showed high incidences of tumor development. The test animals as well as the control animals, the ones that didn't get any treatment. So again, IARC asking the question, can it cause cancer ever? So what's interesting is then you look at a group like the American Cancer Society, which is a pretty legitimate group, indicating that the IARC, here's another way to describe what they do. They describe the level of evidence that of something that can cause cancer, not how likely that it is to cause cancer in any particular person, which is exactly what the EPA does. It's just another way to say what the EPA does, not how likely that something that is potentially toxic could cause cancer in a person. It's interesting to look at other IARC conclusions, and there are a lot of toxic substances that we deal with every day, like cigarettes, arsenic, salami, bacon, sausages, hot dogs, gasoline, a variety of other topics. But the risk or the potential harm is another way to look at that, is a mixture of this formula, toxicity and exposure. So you could have something very toxic, but if you're not exposed to it very often, it's not a high risk. Or you could have something very low toxicity and you're exposed to it every day, well, then it becomes a higher risk. So for example, there's strong evidence, of course, that tobacco smoking and eating processed meat can cause cancer. So they're both listed as in their first highest, most carcinogenic category, that is carcinogenic to humans. Now, so you need to think about those things, that eating processed meat and smoking are not necessarily the same risk, because you don't eat processed meat every day, but you might smoke every day, or you might smoke 3 packs a day. So it's very interesting. But from an IARC standpoint, they're both listed in the same category. So really, from a standpoint of the university and the university researchers, we're not really negating the IARC findings. We're just saying that they use a different system than the EPA. Here's a little bit more of an illustration, and from a slightly different standpoint. Group 1, 2, 2B, Group 3, and Group 4. So it's really interesting. The top one there in the upper left-hand corner, alcoholic beverages. So, some of us drink alcoholic beverages. Very common these days, of course. Tobacco, some people smoke cigarettes and cigars. Ultraviolet radiation, some people go to a Florida beach and lay out in the sun, or even in your backyard. So that's the carcinogenic group, definitely carcinogenic. Then the next group is probably carcinogenic. The one that I really a couple of things here that I really picked up on here, hairdressing. So every 5 weeks or so, I go get my hair cut. And usually the person before me in there is getting some kind of hair product put in. I don't dye my hair or get highlights or anything special to my hair. I just have the hairdresser cut my hair. But it's common for people to dye their hair or put, spikes in it or all that kind of stuff. And all those products that the hairdresser uses are probably carcinogenic. But again, you would want to think about the risk in terms of how often they're used and how dramatic is their exposure. Indoor fireplace use. How often do you have a fireplace? You might want to consider that to an outdoor fire pit where there's a lot more dilution of the smoke. Eating red meat. How often do you eat the red meat? And how many steaks do you actually eat in one particular setting? You skip over to possibly carcinogenic there in the bottom. Well, now it seems to be a little bit of a disconnect here too. The bottom center of this chart, titanium dioxide, which is a sunscreen or a sun cancer preventer, is listed as a possibly carcinogenic active ingredient, whereas the most risky, well, I used that wrong word, the most toxic is in group 1, the ultraviolet radiation that you're trying to prevent is causing skin cancer. So even the products we use to prevent that can cause problems. This is interesting. So jet fuel. So what about the people that work on airplanes? They're exposed to jet fuel. So it's a toxic substance. But again, it gets back to how often. Caffeine, very interesting there, the same kind of thing. These are all products that are used, and we need to think about them in their potential to cause issues. These are some IARC carcinogens: bacon, red meat, beer is a carcinogen. And then two that are really interesting, they're both put in the same classification, glyphosate and red meat. They're both. But again, how often are you exposed to these substances? On the right here, and I don't do a lot of social media, so I'm not sure if this was an Instagram post or a tweet or Facebook or what this is, but this is interesting. So in the terms of wine, you have wine that's produced in the Napa Valley or in Australia or New Zealand. And if glyphosate is used underneath the grapes in order to control weeds, some activists would report that 1 part per billion of glyphosate is probably in wine, and everyone starts screaming poison. At the same time, the same glass also contains 130 million parts per billion of a proven carcinogen in the top category, which is alcohol, but usually you don't have the same level of concern. So it's a matter of perspective, and I think it's important just to consider all of these different issues. Along this line, again, the same kind of thing. If you have a product or an active ingredient, you have to eat a lot of it. So again, it gets back to exposure in order to really cause problems. It gets back to the dosage. How many aspirins do you take? How many gallons of fuel do you put in your car in terms of the exposure? And then how much is the toxicity? What's the level of toxicity? There are other programs or other classifications of groups that sort of work under the realm or the umbrella of the World Health Organization. These three issued proclamations or announcements that disagreed with the IARC, but yet they're in the same umbrella agency. So it's something, again, where you need to look at everything in context. It's interesting when you look at the actual court case, how the IARC announcement was misused. In 2021, so just 3 years ago, the family of, I forgot the fellow's name, Hardiman is his last name, versus Monsanto, who owned the product at the time, awarded $80 million to the plaintiff, which was Hardiman. In this particular situation, tort law was used instead of the more traditional cause and effect type of law. There was a 6-person jury, not a 9-person jury, and there was no expert witness testimony. So there are 3 red flags there when you think about the way regular court cases work. And I explained this to my daughter, who's an attorney, and she said, "Dad, we would never, this is just really strange that would go forward like this, but these kind of things do happen." When you think about judges and juries, they reach conclusions based on persuasive techniques of attorneys as well as evidence. And in this case, the evidence was excluded. The court decision then came as an association or a correlation, not cause and effect. When you think about a cause and effect, you think about spraying Trimac on a lawn. You spray Trimec on a dandelion, 3 days later it dies. That's cause and effect. This was certainly not the case in this situation. So really interesting the way this IARC information was used. When you think about this, it's always good to think about risk in terms of benefit. Why would you take a risk if there were no associated benefits with it? But we do make that decision every day with lots of things. You may not realize that. One of which is transportation, which I think is interesting. You think about, how do you get to work every day? Well, you could drive your car, which I think a lot of people do. And if you do that, you have a 1 in 107 chance of dying in your lifetime. So if you drive your car to work every day, or to church, or to the grocery store every day, you have a 1 in 100, 1 in slightly less than 100 chance of dying from a car accident. But if you ride your bike, now that goes way down. You have 1 in 3,000 chance of dying from riding your bike. You might think, well, that's interesting. You're a little bit more exposed, but the data indicate that 1 in 3,000. Or if you take the bus, now that really makes the most sense, because the bus is really big, and if you run a car into it, the chance of dying is 305,000. So that's a chance of a decision you make every day. Generally, risks are not likely to be acceptable if there's no benefit, either real benefit or a perceived benefit. And sometimes it defies logic. So some risk-related decisions defy logic. So eating fast food or donuts, you think kind of defy. If you look at it without any perceived benefit from eating fast food or donuts, it doesn't make sense. But again, we all do that quite often because the undesirable effects of eating fast food and donuts would lead to weight gain, obesity, heart problems, type 2 diabetes. Yet it's very common that we take that risk because we feel that the benefits outweigh the risk. You get that instant gratification over eating carcinogenic coffee and eating fat-producing or unhealthy donuts because you get that immediate benefit. That's why people take on that risk. When we bring this to the horticultural or the agronomic world, we have the same thing. Why do we use herbicide, even though there might pose some risks? They have benefits. It's helpful to weigh the benefits against using it with the risk associated not using it. Some of them are that people use the herbicides for benefit. The benefit you get from preventing weeds from taking over a park or a lawn or a sports field or a landscape in general. So you're getting some benefit out of taking that risk. Other benefits would include the removal of invasive plants, removal of allergens. This time of year, I'm sneezing and blowing my nose more often because there's some allergens that are bothering me. Safer recreational services, greater aesthetic appeal. Most people don't like to look at a landscape full of weeds, and many other things too. So lots of benefits associated with that. If you drill down a little further, pesticide to herbicide down to glyphosate, why do we use glyphosate? Well, there are 5 things here. First of all, how it works. Glyphosate kills plants by preventing a certain enzyme from being made that makes proteins needed for plant growth. I remember studying this way back. I think there are 3, in fact, alanine, phenylalanine, and tryptophan that are produced, and those are needed. And the glyphosate is a blocker, doesn't allow those to be produced. What's interesting is this enzyme, or these enzymes, plural, not found in animals. Thus, they're at a low risk to humans and other animals, other fauna. Secondly, glyphosate has a low toxicity, and we'll look at the toxicity a little bit later. But just for now, think about it. It's low toxicity. It's a low toxicity active ingredient. Volatility, as you remember from some of your other training, many products have either high or medium or low volatility. Glyphosate is not a volatile active ingredient. It doesn't move through the air readily. So the risk of inhalation to humans is pretty low. Mobility, glyphosate also is not very mobile in water. In fact, if you want to kill aquatic weeds, you have to use a glyphosate plus other active ingredients product. It's not a product that works very well to control weeds in water. Now, there's some potential for surface water contamination if you spray glyphosate on a hillside and it attaches to the soil particles, and then that eventually works its way down into groundwater and, of course, our surface waters. And that's a very definite risk, and we don't want to have that happen. But just on regular ground, that's not going to be a problem. And then the benefit versus other products. Without access to glyphosate, choices could be made to be more mobile, volatile, toxic, or less efficacious products, which would require more application. So for 5 reasons, we get a lot of benefit out of using glyphosate. So those are some of the information or pieces of information that are helpful in just knowing the background on this particular issue and other products in addition to glyphosate. Thinking now about perception, words mean things, and they can conjure up images that are either accurate, positive, or not accurate, and maybe not positive or have a bad association. We've got a list here of different horticultural, agronomic, landscape, green industry types of words that we use, not a nomenclature and jargon there. And each one has a slightly worse or better connotation associated with it. Product is pretty generic, and we use products all the time. You could use the telephone, that's a product. You could use a pesticide, that's a product. The word pesticide itself, to people in the green industry has kind of a neutral association, but to some people who are not well informed, generally it's considered negative. Most people don't know the difference between pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides, and use those names interchangeably, which talks a little bit about it. The word poison is usually considered negative, even by green industry people, although some green industry people shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, I know what that means. It's interesting, the hosts of this program commonly get questions from the general public asking, which poison can I use to control ants under my sink? Those kinds of things. So some people are not averse to using the word poison, but it definitely means different things to different people. The last one there, plant protectant, is an interesting term. The golf industry is probably the best example of that. It's common for golf courses to use various pesticides and or growth regulators to control undesirable effects on a golf course. So about 10 years ago, they started using some placards to label the fact that plant protectants had been applied according to label directions, and everything but just as a piece of information. And overall, the reaction to that information being told to the golfers was positive. Oh, the golf course superintendents are doing a good job here putting on plant protectants. They didn't realize they were growth regulators or herbicides that were applied according to label directions and had low risk. So that's an interesting piece of information. Again, it's all based on perception. Sometimes people get questions about organic pesticides or non-toxic pesticides, which is a bit of a contradiction because there aren't any non-toxic pesticides. If you don't have something that has some toxicity, it won't kill the pest. The other interesting thing about organic products is they don't go through the same barrage of testing that synthetic products do. So in organic products, sometimes you have to just kind of do a little bit more research on before you do all that labeling or form an opinion about the use of an organic product. Perception, and perception is reality. The first time I became aware of perception was during the 80s. This political strategist, Lee Atwater, came up with the phrase, perception is reality, when advising a certain political party, and it made a lot of sense. Perception is reality. Dr. Linda Humphreys, who is a researcher, I don't remember which university, I think Oklahoma, has this phrase, and it's very helpful to us, that perception is a lens or a mindset from which we view people, things, and events. What we perceive is what tends to be accurate. We then create our realities based on these perceptions. And as humans, we get our perceptions from a variety of sources, from friends, relatives, associates, neighbors, from broadcast and print media, social media, from blogs, social media influencers. There are a lot of people that put out opinions and very entertaining social media following, and some that are a little bit scary. We also get it from going to trade shows and sometimes from university programs. And we form opinions from all of these information sources. So it's just good to know that. Again, we have interesting perceptions. And in areas that are not necessarily associated with pesticides, but some that are. Here's a classic study from, I think, in the 90s, where prescription drugs had a high benefit to a low risk. Whereas sometimes you start looking at the active ingredients and, oh boy, maybe we better be a little bit more interested in that. For example, one of the most toxic substances known to man is the product, that the active ingredient that is in Botox. Yet there are a lot of people that go to the dermatologist and get Botox injected directly into their face every month or so to prevent, I think it's wrinkles or whatever they don't want to have. It's about the appearance, right? It's about perception. Pesticides, nuclear power. Again, what are the actual benefits versus the risk? And what are the perceptions of those things? X-rays. How often do you go to your dentist and get an X-ray? Well, they put this big lead apron upon you when you do that. So there's got to be some actual risk involved there. Yet the benefit is often perceived to outweigh the risk. It's helpful to know just how well tested these different products are. And on average, to bring one product to market, it takes 11 years and $286 million because of all the testing that is required. And here you can see kind of a full circle of all the different types of tests that are done by the Environmental Protection Agency in order to bring a product to market so that they can document the actual risk that might be exposed to the environment. Here's another whole long list of all the different tests that are done. This is just kind of a standard battery of tests, but sometimes there are other tests that are done if there's a specific concern or history of using a particular active ingredient. The idea is to reduce risk, but retain the benefit. So it's just to reduce, you can't eliminate the risk, you just kind of reduce it. And there are a number of ways to reduce risk. The product of being applied on the right site, at the right label, wearing the appropriate protective pesticide equipment, using the right equipment, and that's working properly, is going to be the best way in order to get that done. I mentioned, I get frustrated with speakers who say, oh, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Well, this is what I was talking about that we were going to get to a little bit later. So LD50 is a term that you might be familiar with. It's the lethal dose of a particular substance that will kill 50% of the test animals associated with the study. It's one measure of toxicity. You think about these are just common active ingredients we use in our everyday lives. One of the most toxic substances is gasoline. And yet once a week, I go to the gas station and put gas in my car. One of the most toxic substances that I'm aware of, in addition to Botox, is aldicarb. Now, aldicarb was a product that I used in a greenhouse to control whiteflies on poinsettias and geraniums. It's very common pests. Those are very common pests that we have. Now, that product was approved for use by the Environmental Protection Agency. It had an LD50 of 4, so pretty toxic. So when you were using this, you had to really make sure you were using the proper PPE. Since then, it's been taken off the market because of concern about risk. Caffeine is something that I drink most every morning. Aspirin, very similar toxicity to caffeine. Ibuprofen, the common ingredient in Motrin, or something that's over the counter for swelling, inflammation, headaches, that sort of thing. Tylenol, the same kind of thing. So there you have 3 pain relievers, all with very different toxicities, kind of low, medium, and high. They all work a little bit differently. Table salt, I use way too much table salt on my meals, but again, it's a higher or lower, excuse me, higher LD50, therefore a lower toxicity. And then glyphosate, being in this small, short table, being a low toxicity product compared to all these other products that are used. So again, you think about the exposure. How often are you actually exposed to glyphosate? And how often is your customer exposed to glyphosate? If you come out, if you're a lawn care company and you come out 4 times a year to spray, and 2 of those times you apply glyphosate, that's 2 times in 365 days. They're not usually not exposed to glyphosate all that often. The other thing to think about is pesticide tolerance and pesticide residue. And that is an interesting set of terms. A residue is something present in any quantity. It's kind of like the IARC versus the EPA. The pesticide tolerance is the EPA's maximum allowed of pesticide in a raw food. And generally, this is set up kind of in a standard of 100 times less than a dose that could cause an ill effect. And tolerances are set for each pesticide in each food. So based on the toxicity and its breakdown, how much is applied, how it could be exposed. The breakdown is interesting. So where the product is applied, is it applied to laboratory, a factory, or outside, where there's lots of wind and sun to break that particular product down? So that's helpful. When going to talk with your clients or your stakeholders, it's important just to look at kind of remind ourselves a little bit of just the basic illustration pattern. When you go to tell someone something, you encode or create a message, and then you send it through a noisy channel, which could mean a lot of things. But generally, the message is going to be changed a little bit. And then with the person you're talking to or the receiver is going to decode the message. That means they assign meaning to it. It's going to change a little bit more based on perception, based on a lot of things. Then the receiver, if they're going to respond to you, will encode or create a response, send that through a noisy channel. And then the initial sender, or the initial sender kind of switches to becoming a receiver, and they decode the message or assign some meaning to it. So this all happens within, a short period of time, maybe 5 seconds or so. And some of these noisy channels could be considered an interrupter or a blocker. It might be an unfamiliar or an odd word. It could be the initial perception. It could be a false perception. It could be their time and attention. It could be the person's not having enough time to pay close attention. It could be a lot of things. And here's a list of a lot of things. This is Amy Blochka, and Amy is social media ghostwriter, which means that you could go to Amy and hire her to do your social media for you if you're not particularly well versed in it. And so she has been really keyed into the message interrupter distractions. One of the things she talks a lot about is, especially to the influencers who speak and do Instagram and that kind of thing, is monotone delivery, or the lack of vocal variety. That is a real distraction to a lot of people. Accents, if you're in the Midwest, you might have heard people from Boston who park their car in Harvard Yard, or people from the South who talk with a drawl, or a twang. They may produce the word, the black stuff that bubbles out of the ground that we refine to make gasoline and jet fuel out of. They may have it as a 1-syllable word called all. I would say something like oil, which is a 2-syllable word. It sounds very different than all. And there's just a whole list of things that interrupt a message or distract or change a message. Body language, facial expressions, frowning, The preconceived notion, we've kind of talked about that, the assumption that someone mentions, or assumption that people have when you mention the word pesticides, like, oh gosh, they've heard a lot about pesticide. Some of the assumptions may not be accurate. They may have a low hearing level. They may have what I have, which is tinnitus, a ringing in your ear all the time. There might be background noise. You might use jargon with them, like PGR, plant growth regulator. You might talk about IPM, integrated pest management. And that immediately, if they don't know what that means, could immediately be an issue. One of the ones that is really interesting is if you ask them or they ask you a question, and it's a yes or no question, and they give you a non-answer. They don't answer yes or no. That can be a big issue too. So that's something that's important. So in this process of communication, this communication circle or oval, when you're visiting with a client or a stakeholder, need to kind of do a gut check and ask yourself, do you listen or simply wait to talk? And I am very guilty of waiting to talk when I really should be listening and then customizing my answer to the question they asked me. So I have to claim being guilty on this one. One way to help yourself with this is to avoid interrupting, pausing before answering. It's not only polite, it allows a little bit of time for the person to share, completely share, and sometimes it's hard to know when they're finished. Also, it provides you a little bit more time to formulate your answer based on their question and what they're actually asking you. Now, Emily and Elizabeth and Kelly and I know this particular presenter. This is David Horshauger. He is the author of The Trust Edge, and he also has a good consulting company based on the importance of trust within a company, within an organization. And he has the 8 C's: compassion, character, competency, commitment, all these good things that are important. But the one that he lists first is clarity. And so why does he list clarity? It's because people trust the clear and mistrust the ambiguous or overly complex. So the important thing is the takeaway from David's messaging is to be clear yourself, and then also ask for clarification from others. What do you mean by fill in the blank? I don't understand your concern. Because that can be very, very helpful to understand the concern. So this is Valerie Brown. She's a risk perception expert. In the bottom on the left, there's a lot of words here. On the bottom on the left, she identifies that trust, just like David Horshauger did, trust is the most influential emotional aspect. And when you start talking about this subject, it's very emotional, or can be. And it's really just gets back to our own innate makeup. It's a natural extension of our hardwired ability to quickly size up threats using a lot of different kind of skills, emotions being one of them. And then again, generally people can come to an issue with fear, anger, and mistrust if they feel that their concerns are being mishandled or simply they're not being heard. And they're the angriest or least trusting when they don't know the risks of an exposure, or they don't feel that that's been accurate, or they've been misled, or they've been exposed without their consent, or something along those lines. So Valerie brings us a good message when it comes to this. Again, here's another person that we all, the presenters have grown to appreciate and trust, Dr. Larry Schultz. He was a pesticide specialist and knew a lot about this subject. When it comes to evaluating toxicity or risk, as humans, we're a lot more comfortable with things that we're familiar with and fully aware of. If it sounds odd or something that came from a dusty textbook, people generally develop an aversion to taking an action. So that's good to keep in mind. When communicating or talking with people who are dubious, who are not sure of what's going on that you're communicating with, it's always good to keep return on investment in mind. And there's definitely this law of diminishing returns. So you can communicate with them, But after a while, you're like beating the dead horse, and the biggest time waster is not going to be helpful to you. It's not going to be helpful to your client, and it helps to erode your bottom line. Yet most of us realize this way too late after they've already invested a lot of time and energy in the communication process and talking with them. It's important to know some of these other messaging factors. You really don't want to assume that all customers have the same background. You know, some are attorneys themselves, or they're doctors, or roofers, or hairstylists, instructional designers, whatever. And they don't have, some have a lot of background. Some of them may know more about pesticides than you do. And some of them, I talked one time to a fellow who asked me a specific question, but he was a product development specialist with the company SC Johnson, which makes Raid. So he knew a lot about pesticides. He just had a very specific question he didn't know the answer to. So you can't assume that people have a background similar to yours. Some people have children and pets. And as humans, we're hardwired to take care of children and pets, right? So you really want to be very careful and protective of children and pets, as well as yourself. And everyone comes to a discussion with different perceived notions and biases. So if you know a little bit or a lot about your customer's background, that can be helpful. The Greek philosopher Aristotle knew this, that we all have different ways we come to this. And he clarified it as ethos, pathos, and logos. And ethos is credibility or ethical appeal, like the reputation of an ISA certified arborist. Pathos is this emotional response, highlighting the potential for harm if no action is taken. Now, pathos is really kind of like playing with fire. Be really careful with emotion, because it can really stir up trouble where there is no trouble. And then logos is logic, persuading by using reasoning and logic. So in other words, if A happens, then B or C will happen. So pest control or pest removal will lead to healthier turf, reduced maintenance costs, and greater return on investment. So now the important thing to realize, again, with your clients is that we work with all three of these realms. No one is 100% ethos. No one is 100% logos. Some people are much more in one area than others, but again, it's that word. Here's a possible messaging point. Again, it gets back to the notion of risk, and it's a matter of toxicity and exposure. On the toxicity side, we have the product signal word, caution, danger, or caution, danger. What are the three? Caution, danger. Sorry, there's another one there. Warning, thank you. So that's an indicator. The dosage estimate, or the rate that you're thinking about. Any signs and symptoms that might be reported in the literature, as well as how fast they come on. And then, of course, the exposure part, how often you're going to be in contact with that active ingredient. What is the route of it? Is it dermal or oral? Is it through the air? What are the physical and chemical properties? And this one I keep coming back to because I think it's the most relevant. The duration and the frequency of exposure. Is it once a day? Is it once a month? Is it once a year? And is it for an hour or 8 hours? When you are exposed to a product. This comes from a pesticide communicator at Oregon State. And I think there's some really important things to think about. Again, this might help you more than it does your client, but you could share them if they have questions. All the different types of testing. This could be a good, it should at least give you a little bit of confidence in using pesticides, but also it can be helpful in messaging that you might, and again, just to kind of reiterate all the different tests that are done by the EPA in order to bring a product to market, especially these last two, the animal toxicology and the environmental fate. So it's the people in the environment and the environment itself. I think these kind of things can be very reassuring to both yourself and to stakeholders. As well, the possible messaging points. Again, we've already talked about this a little bit. 100 safety studies, $286 million, 11 years to bring the product to market. and among the highest standards of scientific testing in the world. Another messaging point, really the problem with using the word safe. We recommend against using the word safe when describing anything, but especially pesticide. Really, when you look at it, safe is absolute. When you say something is safe, you're making a guarantee that there's a 0% chance of anything adverse happening as a result. So the word safe is kind of off limits, as well as making extreme claims like, oh, don't worry about this stuff I'm spraying on the sports field. You could drink this stuff. Extreme claims are just as bad as extreme concerns. So it's a couple of don'ts there. Instead, try to relate concerns to something tangible, something reasonable. Any reference to other should be made to products, everyday types of products. And then also a couple things here, just thinking about this, all substances are poisonous. In fact, there aren't any that aren't. And the dosage is what differentiates a poison from a remedy. You think about that in terms of pharmaceuticals that you take too many pain relievers, you could have very bad effects from it. If you take 2, you're probably just going to get rid of your headache. And the dose makes the poison for a variety of things, like eye drops. Oh my gosh. You think about something, again, you're putting it into your eyes, which are probably one of the most important organs you can have in your body. So a lot of testing, believe me, is taken by the people who make eye drops. Some other messaging points, and this might be helpful to diffuse any kind of concern or hesitation that people might have with you spraying pesticides on a park grounds. Pesticides are only one tool that we use to manage pests. We don't just spray and pray. We also aerate turf, or we fertilize trees or flowers. We do mowing, irrigation, overseeding, using improved cultivars, mulching to control weeds. These are all examples of pest control that we use to either improve the health of something, to have it be more naturally resistant to pests, or actual pest control methods that are not related to pesticides. So there's a lot of non-pesticide related pest management tools we use, and some are more direct than others, but they're all important in creating a healthy landscape. It's important to communicate post-application instructions to the client, such as watering it in. I put on this pesticide. It's important for you to water it in so that it kills the grubs. And doing so will also reduce your inhalation risk. The restricted re-entry interval, how often you need to stay off the lawn or the landscape after application. So, I think if you're pressed on whether a product is safe, a possible last resort type of answer might be that it's safe when it's using according to label directions, and we always follow label directions. But boy, that's still pretty problematic. I'd really try to steer clear of even addressing that. Yeah, but if you're pressed on it, again, it's kind of like answering or not answering that yes/no question. You really do want to answer, but you could even just give the answer, yes, it's safe, but safe really means that it can never cause a problem ever. And that's just not an issue. Here's a checklist from Casey again, to really help the bottom line in terms of communication. Listening, asking questions, clarifying, paraphrasing to make sure you understand, framing the whole thing as risk rather than safety. And what is the risk? We're trying to reduce the benefit or reduce the risk, keep the benefits. Talking about pertinent toxicity information, talking about pertinent exposure information, underscoring the benefits of an application, highlighting the action items that are in the customer's control, and then giving information on where they can get more information, communicating where they can find those pieces, I think are very helpful. I kind of want to end with this quote from an athlete, I thought, who kind of broke the glass ceiling in terms of tennis. Before Arthur Ashe, there were no black tennis players on a national level. his one of his phrases that he liked to use was start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. In other words, start where you are, wherever you are right today, with your capacity and ability to communicate. Then use what you have. So you've got a whole hour's worth of information here on how to communicate effectively, and then do what you can. And if people aren't willing to listen, maybe it's time to move on to other customers who will listen. And again, this is either for you or for your client, where to look for more information. Pesticides and risk communication, very, very helpful stuff here on how to get through this. There's, I think, 5 or 6 different QR codes that we have, and you can get these from the recording, or if you would like, we could send these out to you as well. Here's from the National Pesticide Information Center. This is from the American Cancer Society, again, a very reputable source. This is from Oregon State, from Casey Buell, communicating risk around glyphosate, and another one around glyphosate itself. So this one, this is more general, the Ag Health Study, and they will give you the information that you need.
Thank you,
right.
John.
So I think I hit my mark. I ended up right with an hour. So I think, do we have time for a question or two, Kelly?
I think sure, for a couple of questions, if anybody has one that they would like to ask, or a comment or a suggestion. It's good information, since we all either work with pesticides or we work with clientele who are concerned with pesticides, or maybe sometimes it's a lack of concern. It's great to have that information on communication. I'm not seeing any questions at this time. So I think we can go ahead and go on with our next presentation, which is